Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around. Maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor. Barefoot. Dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it. That awful, crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. I've been hiking alone for years. I love the silence, the way the world fades into nothing but trees and sky. It makes me feel small in the best way possible, like I'm part of something bigger. Out there, there's no stress, no noise, no people. Just me and the trail. I've done plenty of solo trips, sometimes for days at a time. I know how to prepare, how to navigate, how to stay safe. I don't take unnecessary risks, but sometimes the wilderness doesn't care how prepared you are. I learned that the hard way. The plan was a simple 3-day solo hike through a remote section of forest, miles from any marked trails. I had spent weeks planning it, studying old maps, checking weather conditions, packing everything I might need. The route wasn't completely uncharted, but it wasn't well-traveled either. A handful of hunters and experienced backpackers had probably passed through over the years, but that was it. That's exactly why I chose it. The first few miles were easy, the trees thin, the ground firm under my boots. I followed an old logging road for a while before veering off into the deeper woods. The further I got, the quieter it became. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I made good time. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing where I had planned to set up camp for the first night. It was perfect, a flat patch of earth, a small stream nearby, plenty of firewood. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and built a fire as the sun started sinking behind the trees. I ate quickly and sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames flicker. The night was clear, stars bright above the canopy. I should have felt at peace, but something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks on me. It happens sometimes when you're deep in the woods, especially when you're by yourself. You become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. Your mind starts filling in the blanks. I shook it off and went to bed. I woke up to a sound outside my tent. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Not an animal. Not the quick, darting steps of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. These were careful, steady steps. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense. Nothing. After what felt like forever, I reached for my knife and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers. The woods were dark, still. No movement, no sound. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The night before seemed distant, like a bad dream. I convinced myself it had just been an animal after all. Maybe a stray deer wandering through. I packed up and started hiking again. The trail became steeper, the forest denser. It was slow going, but I was making progress. By midday, I stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop. That's when I saw it. A footprint, fresh, not mine. It was pressed deep into the dirt, the edges still crisp. Someone else was out here. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my car. This wasn't a popular area. There were no marked trails, no campsites. I stood there for a long time, listening. The woods were silent. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe another hiker had come through recently. Maybe a hunter. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached my next planned campsite. This one was higher up, near a ridge with a view of the valley below. It should have felt safe, but the feeling was still there, that sense of being watched. I set up camp quickly, keeping my knife close as I built a fire. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, masking smaller sounds. I kept scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Nothing. I forced myself to eat. Night fell. The fire crackled. Then I saw something. A flicker of movement. Deep in the trees, just past the firelight. I froze, staring into the darkness. My pulse hammered in my ears. Nothing. Just the trees shifting in the wind. I told myself it was nothing. I went to bed with my knife in my hand. I woke up to find footprints circling my tent. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They were deep, pressed into the damp earth, looping around my tent before disappearing into the trees. I stared at them, my chest tightening. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed up fast. No breakfast, no rest. I just threw my gear into my pack and started moving. I wanted to get out. Now, I moved quickly, following my planned route. But the deeper I went, the more things stopped making sense. The terrain was wrong. The trees looked unfamiliar. I checked my map, my compass. I was heading the right direction, but nothing looked right. I kept going, forcing down the rising panic. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. Another campsite, not mine, an old one, a fire pit, long cold, a torn sleeping bag, scattered gear, no people, no footprints, just abandoned. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the empty campsite. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, or hadn't left at all. I turned and kept moving. I hiked fast, barely stopping, heart hammering in my chest. The woods felt different now, heavier. Then I saw movement, not ahead of me, behind me, a flicker of motion through the trees. Someone was following me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just walked faster. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine, keeping pace with me. I broke into a run. The forest blurred around me. Branches whipped against my arms. I stumbled, caught myself, kept going. The footsteps followed. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I burst out onto an old dirt road. My car was there. I had made it back. I didn't stop running until I reached the driver's side door. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. For a long moment, I just sat there, panting, hands shaking. Then finally, I looked back at the tree line. Nothing, just still, silent forest. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never reported it. I don't know if anyone would believe me, but I know what I felt, and I know I'll never hike alone again. I've been hiking solo for years. Something about being alone in the woods always felt right to me. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of moving through untouched nature without a schedule or responsibility. It cleared my head like nothing else could. That's why I took the trip. It was late September, just as summer was starting to fade into fall. The days were still warm, but the nights had that creeping cold that reminded you winter wasn't far away. Perfect hiking weather. I had planned for a 2-day trek, one night in the woods, nothing extreme, just a break from normal life. The trail I picked wasn't popular. That was intentional. I didn't want crowds, didn't want families with screaming kids or loud groups blaring music from portable speakers. I wanted solitude. I found a place deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. A long, winding dirt road led to the trailhead, and by the time I got there, my car was the only one in the small gravel parking lot. That was a good sign. I took my time checking my gear before heading in. Backpack loaded with food, water, tent, and emergency supplies. A map, a compass, a flashlight with extra batteries. I even had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't careless. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well defined, though clearly not used often. Fallen leaves covered the dirt path, crunching under my boots as I walked. The forest was dense, but the sunlight filtered through in streaks, warm and golden. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was exactly what I needed. By midday, I had covered about 6 miles. I stopped near a creek, ate a protein bar, and drank some water while listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. I felt good. That feeling didn't last. After my break, I got back on the trail. The plan was to go another 4 or 5 miles before setting up camp for the night. The path started to get rougher, not difficult, just less maintained. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully, and parts of the trail were narrow, with steep drop-offs to one side. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. A boot print. It was old, partially washed out from rain, but it was there. Someone had been through here before me, which wasn't strange on its own. But what was strange was how deep it was. Like whoever left it had been carrying something heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, just something I noticed. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimming as the canopy closed in above me. The trail felt different now, more overgrown, less defined. I checked my map. I was still on the right path, at least I should have been. Then I saw the second footprint. This one was fresher, and it wasn't alone. There were several, all leading in the same direction I was going. But something was wrong with them. They weren't normal hiking steps. They were erratic, spaced unevenly, like someone had been stumbling or limping. A cold feeling settled in my gut. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had gotten tired, maybe they had a bad knee. There were 100 explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept moving. The trail got worse. The further I went, the less it looked like a real hiking path. The trees grew closer, the underbrush thickening. I checked my map again. I should have reached a fork in the trail by now, a spot marked on the map where the path split. One route leading to a scenic overlook, the other continuing deeper into the forest. But there was no fork, just an unbroken stretch of trees in every direction. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been following the trail. I hadn't gone off course, but now the trail wasn't there. I turned around. The path behind me was gone. That wasn't possible. I had just come from there, but when I looked back, all I saw were trees, thick and unbroken. The footprints, mine included, were gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavier. The forest was silent.
No birds.
No wind. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, distant, like something moving through the trees. Not an animal. Something bigger. I turned in slow circles, scanning the forest. Nothing. Just trees, stretching in every direction. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm, took out my compass. The needle spun uselessly, refusing to settle. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled out my map, but it felt pointless. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. The landscape around me was different from what had been marked. I wasn't lost. Something else was wrong. I picked a direction and started walking. I needed to find anything familiar, a landmark, a clearing, even just a way out of the thick trees. I kept my breathing steady, moving carefully, trying not to panic. Then I saw it. A structure. Not a house, not a cabin. Something smaller. A metal cage. It sat in a small clearing, rusted and old. Too big for an animal trap, too small for a proper holding cell. The bars were bent in places, the door hanging open. And inside, something lay crumpled on the ground. Bones. A mix of animal and human. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Then, behind me, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I walked. Then I walked faster. Then I ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I thought I was going to collapse. Then suddenly I was back at the trailhead. I don't remember how I got there. One moment, I was deep in the woods, running from something I never saw. The next, I was standing beside my car, gasping for breath, covered in scratches and dirt. I didn't question it. I just got in my car and drove. I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic, just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees. The scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind.
No insects.
No running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful. Not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped, right next to me. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people. No old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back. I always camped alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked it that way. No distractions, no small talk, just me and the woods. It was the one place where I didn't have to think about anything except the next fire, the next meal, the next morning. I had taken dozens of solo trips over the years, but this one was going to be the deepest I had ever gone. I had spent weeks planning it, tracing routes on the map, marking out possible sites. No trails, no roads, just deep forest and the promise of silence. I told myself this would be the trip I remembered for the rest of my life. I wasn't wrong. I left before sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a hatchet, my rifle. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 miles on a rough dirt road that felt like it hadn't been maintained in years. When I finally reached the spot where I had to leave my truck, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the tree line, feeling the weight of the isolation ahead. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the ground was clear, the kind of place where you could feel the silence settle in your bones. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek, set down my pack, and took a long drink from my canteen. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only movement was the water and the occasional bird flitting through the branches. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rock face on one side. The kind of place where I could sit with my back against the stone, looking out at the woods, knowing nothing could come at me from behind. I set up my tent near the rock wall, cleared out a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a meal out of a vacuum-sealed bag, watching the flames flicker. That was the last normal moment of the trip. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just thick, suffocating stillness. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere just beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, another footstep. Closer. I sat up slowly, gripping the rifle, my eyes scanning the darkness. My fire had burned too low to see far, just enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The eye strained my ears. Silence. After what felt like an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the fire. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I threw more wood on the fire, watching as the flames flared up, pushing back the dark. Then I saw it. A shape just at the edge of the light. Tall, still, watching. I jerked my rifle up, my hands shaking. My breath came fast, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there for the rest of the night, my back against the rock, my rifle in my lap. Morning came slow. The woods were back to normal. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Almost. I searched the ground where the figure had been.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was too deep in my own head. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day gathering wood, walking the area, trying to focus on anything except the lingering unease. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shift in the wind made me grip my rifle tighter. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The zipper on my tent. Moving. Something was outside. Something was trying to get in. I lunged for my rifle, yanked back the bolt. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, footsteps, fast, retreating into the trees. I sat there, my pulse slamming in my ears, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn was slow. I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff with tension. The air was cold, the fire just smoldering coals. Then I saw it. A single handprint on the outside of my tent. Not an animal. Not my imagination. A human handprint. It was time to leave.
I packet fast. No break fast, no lingering.
I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started walking. I moved fast, almost running. The woods felt different now, watching, waiting. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Then, after a few miles, I saw something that made my stomach turn to ice. A tree, with something carved into the bark. My name. I turned and ran. The rest of the hike was a blur. Just the pounding of my boots, the hammering of my pulse. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck just as the sun dipped below the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching. I slammed the truck into drive, tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not breathing until I hit pavement. I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe it was boredom, maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I found myself deep in the woods with nothing but a backpack, a tent, and a night ahead of me. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but something about this place felt different. I had driven for hours to reach the spot, an area far from any major trails. The idea was to get away from everything. No cell service, no noise, just me and nature. I parked my truck on the side of an old dirt road, loaded my gear, and hiked in. The path was overgrown, barely visible, but I had studied the maps beforehand. I knew where I was going, or at least I thought I did. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching over twigs and dirt. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched even when you weren't. After about an hour, I found a clearing. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground, surrounded by trees, far from any trails where people might wander through. I set down my pack, pitched my tent, and got to work gathering firewood. The sun was setting fast, and I wanted a fire going before dark. As I walked around picking up sticks and broken branches, I noticed something strange. The woods didn't smell right. Usually you get that earthy scent, damp leaves, pine, maybe the faint smell of moss. But here, the air was stale, almost metallic. I ignored it, chalking it up to my imagination, and went back to camp. The fire crackled as night settled in. I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal of canned beans and beef jerky, listening to the stillness around me. Normally, even in remote areas, you'd hear something, an owl, distant coyote howls, maybe the occasional rustling from a small animal. But here, nothing. It was unsettling. I told myself it was just a quiet night, that maybe the animals had moved on or were just being unusually still. I kept the fire going for a while, letting the warmth and light push back the darkness. But eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint red glows on the trees. I lay there listening. There was a sound, faint, distant, but getting closer. It was footsteps, not the skittering of an animal, not the rhythmic crunch of a deer moving through the brush. These were slow, deliberate steps, human. I held my breath. They stopped just outside my campsite. I stared at the tent fabric, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I waited, ears straining, but nothing happened. Just silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't check my watch. I just lay there, frozen. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, that I was half dreaming, that the woods were playing tricks on me. I forced myself to close my eyes. Then the sound came again, closer. I bolted upright, my breathing shallow. I reached for my flashlight and my knife, my hands shaking. I wanted to look, but at the same time, I didn't. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to stay still, to not give away that I was awake. But I couldn't sit there forever. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My flashlight was off, but the dim embers of the fire still gave off a little light. There was nothing there, no movement, no figure, just my camp, the trees, and the faint glow of dying firelight. I exhaled, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was an animal after all, something that had wandered close and then left. Maybe I was just on edge. I zipped the tent back up, lay down, and tried to convince myself everything was fine. Then I heard it, breathing, right outside the tent. A deep, slow inhale, then an even slower exhale. I gripped my knife so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was beating so fast it hurt. I didn't move. The breathing continued, Whoever or whatever was out there was standing right next to my tent, just on the other side of the fabric. I forced myself to stay quiet, barely daring to breathe. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound faded. Slow, deliberate steps moved away from my tent, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste time packing up. I threw everything into my backpack, kicked dirt over the remains of my fire, and started hiking back toward my truck. My entire body was tense, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I let myself breathe. I tossed my gear into the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and that's when I saw it. Just off the tree line, standing perfectly still, was a man. He wasn't moving. He wasn't waving. Just standing there watching me. I didn't wait. I slammed the truck into gear and peeled out, kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the highway, back in civilization. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I saw a man in the woods? All I know is that I won't be going back. And if you ever find yourself camping alone, deep in the woods, miles away from anyone else, you might not be as alone as you think. Hiking alone has always been my thing. It started as a way to clear my head, then became a personal challenge. Seeing how far I could go, how well I could handle myself in the wild. I liked the feeling of isolation, the quiet of the deep woods where there's nothing but you and nature. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, some lasting days, but this trip was supposed to be different. A simple overnight hike. Nothing extreme. The plan was to take a little-used trail in a national forest, camp for the night near a remote creek, then head back the next morning. I had checked the map dozens of times. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, a GPS, a paper map, and a knife just in case. I wasn't worried. It was just another hike. I reached the trailhead early, before sunrise. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't surprising. This trail wasn't popular, and that was part of the reason I had picked it. I like solitude. The less chance of running into loud weekend hikers, the better. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well-defined, cutting through thick pines and following the curve of a ridge. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth strong in my nose. Birds called out from the trees, and every so often, I could hear the distant rush of a stream. Everything felt normal, but about 4 miles in, something changed. I didn't notice it right away. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something was different. The forest seemed quieter. The usual hum of insects and rustling leaves faded. The air felt still, heavier somehow. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. I checked my GPS. The signal was weak but still working. I was on the right path. I kept moving. After another mile, I came across a fork in the trail. That wasn't on my map. I stopped, pulling out the paper map to compare. According to it, the trail should have been a straight shot toward the creek with no forks or side trails. But standing there, I saw 2 clear paths, one continuing in the direction I had been heading, the other veering slightly right, downhill into thicker woods. I hesitated. Maybe the map was outdated. Maybe this was a game trail or an unofficial path made by hikers. I decided to stick to the original route and keep moving forward. That was my second mistake. Another mile passed, and I started to notice other odd things. Small things, but they added up. A tree with deep claw marks, too big for a normal animal. A pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. A silence that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. The claw marks could have been from a bear. The rock pile, maybe some hiker messing around. But that uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I was relieved. Footprints meant people. But as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. They were fresh, too fresh. The dirt was still loose around the edges, and they were deep, like someone had been running. And then I saw something worse. They weren't going in one direction. They circled. Whoever made them had been walking in circles, over and over. The tracks crisscrossed each other, overlapping, as if someone had been pacing the same spot for hours. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move on. The sun was dipping lower now, shadows stretching across the trail. I needed to find a campsite soon. The creek was still another mile ahead, and I was desperate to get there before dark. I picked up my pace. About 15 minutes later, I saw something that made me stop cold. A backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, half hidden by bushes. An old one, faded, torn in places. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. It had been there for a while. The fabric was stiff, covered in dirt and pine needles. But that wasn't what bothered me. It was unzipped and empty. No gear, no food wrappers, nothing. Just an abandoned pack, like someone had set it down and never came back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I had seen old gear left behind before. People lost things, or in some cases got careless and left trash behind. But this felt wrong. I didn't touch it. I kept moving. By the time I reached the creek, the last light was fading. I found a flat spot near the water and set up camp. My hands were shaking, but I told myself I was just tired. I built a small fire, ate a granola bar, and forced myself to breathe. I was fine, just paranoid. The forest was silent as I sat there, staring into the flames. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. A single snapping twig. Close. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees, shifting shadows. Another snap. Closer this time. I slowly reached for my knife. The fire crackled, casting flickering light around my small camp. My ears strained, listening. Then nothing. Minutes passed. The woods stayed silent. I stayed awake for hours, gripping the knife in my lap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent but left the knife close. Sleep was shallow, broken by every small noise outside. When I woke, the fire was out. The morning light filtered through the trees. Everything looked normal. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, right outside my tent. Not mine. They were fresh, deep. They circled my campsite. I didn't waste time. I packed up in minutes, barely stopping to eat. My body was on high alert, every nerve screaming at me to get out. I hiked fast, practically running down the trail. My GPS kept losing signal, but I didn't stop. I just needed to make it back. The forest still felt wrong. The silence, the pressure in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, an hour into my hike back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same fork in the trail. But this time, my footprints from yesterday were gone. Like I had never been there at all. I didn't stop. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. When I finally saw the trailhead, my truck sitting alone in the empty parking lot, I nearly collapsed. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I will never hike that trail again.